Magic podcast, the podcast that searches for answers to all things fandom through social science and everything else in the world, so to speak. I'm your host, as always, Forward Progress, and I'm joined again by the lovely and talented Miss Nova Rose.
Hello.
And this week's episode, our special guest is the one and only Brass Robo.
Hi.
And for this episode today, we're going to tackle an issue that's been on my mind lately, and that is what I'm referring to as legacy franchises or legacy properties. So what do I mean by legacy franchises here? What I'm referring to is a franchise that has had a long storied existence that has gone through multiple iterations or incarnations over time. Where we're going with that is things like Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, potentially My Little Pony even within this. We're going to get to all of this throughout the session here. But essentially what we're looking at is these properties that have been around for a long time and the evolution therein. So I know here everybody's kind of got a little bit of a different field that they play with on this. I know, granted, I'm assuming everybody here is definitely had the Star Wars fix in their life.
Of course.
Of course.
Yeah. Now I in my teenage years became a huge Star Trek nerd, so I definitely have that background. Yes, Trekkie, Trekker, whatever. Call me what you want. I'm just a nerd and damn proud of it. But one thing I know is one of the big things with recruiting our friend Brass Robo here for this episode was I definitely wanted somebody with more knowledge on Doctor Who.
Right.
So definitely. So I think the big thing here, I guess a general opening question here is on those properties that we've followed over time and we've known and loved that have seen changes even within the last few years. I mean, all the major ones that I referenced have had, I think, pretty major changes or shifts in the franchises over the last several years. Is do you feel that these properties are making progress in a positive way?
Forward progress?
Interesting question. Yes and no. I think it's been a mixed bag. Star Trek, because I've actually familiar with all three of them. Star Wars, latest movies weren't the best, but the Mandalorian series is really good. With Star Trek, the Discovery series is pretty hit and miss, but Picard, again, really good. And with regards to Doctor Who, the show's basically been rebooted a few years ago. It does this every couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the reboot of the Chris Chibnall era, because I was a really huge fan of the previous era, the Stephen Moffat era.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely areas where I can point out and say, it's doing something really good. The historical episodes in particular have been just really good these past seasons. Oh, and the Master is really good also. That actor is just killing it.
I was going to ask about that. So my knowledge of Doctor Who is admittedly limited. I believe I've seen one Doctor Who movie and one episode, and that's it. So I have a very small pool of experience to draw from. But
Peter Cushing or Paul McGann?
So which was it?
Was it an old guy in a really disco TARDIS, or a young guy who looks like a violinist in a steampunk TARDIS?
Younger guy. It was a younger guy. Well, actually, wait. The movie that I saw was The Five Doctors.
Ah.
Um, but that's an but the thing that it just made me think of, and it's a definite point of discussion within these, is when you have a property that's been around for so long, you run into issues where either actors' contracts end, they decide they want to leave, do other things, or, I mean, and it's just a reality, I hate to bring it up, but people pass away. And the show continues, the movies, whatever have you. So that's kind of an interesting thing here for a show like Doctor Who, especially, because I know you mentioned the Master, and I know that's like a role that's been around for like ever, right?
Yeah, since the 70s, I believe.
Yeah, so it's kind of one of those things about when you get those iconic characters, it gets in an interesting way when there's inevitably a time where either an actor moves on or isn't available, and what the reaction is, because I'm assuming it's been different individuals playing the Master too, or am I
Yes.
wrong on that?
In the revival series, there have been, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 actors who've played the role.
Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things I've been curious about, especially in other properties where roles end up getting recast for one reason or another, is within fan communities, how is that reaction? Is it that thing of like, we welcome this, we accept the reality of it, or the converse that we see sometimes is, you can't recast this person, how dare you?
Well, what I've noticed with Doctor Who is that there's this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, the Doctor himself is recast every few years.
Right.
And what happens is, you get the new actor, everyone hates it. Then, and it's like, he's too young, he's too old, he's too female, which is the latest problem. Then the actor really sort of just fills the role. You get these really good episodes, everyone loves them, and then the actor says, okay, well, it's time to go. And then, oh no, you can't recast the role. The last guy was so iconic, this new guy is, too whatever. And it's this cycle that happens every, 3-4 years.
I remember a few years back, I can't remember exactly how many, but I remember when Capaldi signed on to take the role, and there was, like I said, I only follow the series so much, but I would hear things of just people just really unsure about Capaldi at first. And then not that long ago, I'd hear people talking about like how much they loved the Capaldi era. And I'm like, it is interesting to see this change, this dynamic of that. And maybe it's just a matter of that human predisposition to not like change.
Yeah, that's right. It's happened to literally everyone who's played the role since probably since Patrick Troughton, since the second Doctor.
Although David Tennant's still.
Well, David Tennant is one amazing actor in general.
Yeah.
Like, getting him to play Scrooge McDuck in the DuckTales reboot was a stroke of genius. Whoever thought to cast him.
Yeah, he's been killing in that show.
Oh my gosh, the new there might be a future episode of the podcast that's literally me gushing over how good the new DuckTales series is, but
it's amazing.
It's so good. It's so good, and the writing is solid. The nods are there. The characters are so dynamic. Gosh, I'm just gonna turn this into a gush fest. But you know what? No, actually, because I can spin this into our topic today. Because DuckTales is an interesting example of a series that I remember watching it and loving it as a kid. Back in, I guess it was the late 80s, might have been when it first came out. I remember watching it as a very young child and really enjoying it. And now seeing the reboot. And at first, when I heard they were going to reboot it, I had that like hesitation of like, oh, what are they doing? And then I got excited when I found out that they got David Tennant for it, and that was the thing that made me go, okay, I'll check it out. But this is definitely one of those examples where the newer iteration, I think, surpassed the old iteration, which doesn't happen all that often.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because one of the things they did with that show is that they drew more inspiration from the original, like Carl Barks comics.
Exactly.
And if you count those, then DuckTales has been around since, well, 40.
Yeah. And that's a good point that I think is an interesting thing to look at here with a lot of these properties that when you think of Star Wars is a good example, because when you think of Star Wars, I think the average person their mind will go to the films, the core films, the core, I guess, 9 episodes. But even within the films, we've had several other films, not even just, we had Solo and Rogue One not that long ago, but they were Ewok movies. I want to say that was in the 80s.
Yeah.
There's been all kinds of different things. And then you also have books, comics, now TV series with the Mandalorian.
Holiday specials.
The holiday special.
The Gendy Tartakovsky cartoon.
Oh my gosh. You know what's funny is we actually watched a little bit of that recently and just marveling over how much we loved it.
That man really understands act.
Mm-hmm. Because the thing about that one was what was interesting with that cartoon was it was one of the first images or actual footage of General Grievous we got was in that cartoon, and it made General Grievous seem like so much more of a badass than he ended up being in episode 3, in my opinion.
Totally.
He was a pushover. He was even a pushover in the reboot Clone Wars series.
Well, you know what? But it's an interesting thing of there's so many different interpretations you can take, and I think that's the thing we've seen with these types of franchises over the years is there's different interpretations on the same lore. It has the same backstory, the same basics, but you get it into a different person's hands, and all of a sudden it morphs into something new, something different. And I think Star Wars is actually a fantastic example of that here, where even in the films recently, you went from Abrams start helming episode 7 to Rian Johnson helming episode 8. And regardless of what you have to say about either of them, there's a definite tonal shift between them. And I think a lot of critique, and I'm not going to say, I mean, I think it's a valid critique, would be that tonal shift makes it hard to look at it as a cohesive unit. But at the same token, what's to say you can't have a different interpretation out there of that same property? And who's to say what is or isn't right on those terms?
I think the fact that you had that tonal shift within like one series is where a lot of the problems are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Because like if there had been 2 film series, one Abrams, one Johnson, you can enjoy them separately.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's 3 movies, one after the other, the people who like the first film aren't necessarily going to be the people who like the second film and vice versa. So I think that's kind of where the problem comes from, that it's not that either of them was better, it's just they're so widely different in their interpretations that, having them side by side like that creates a problem.
And I think that's the medium in which something is consumed, I think definitely has an impact. Speaking of Star Wars, I think it was something we all talked about, and I knew was going to happen, and then it happened, of the sense of Star Wars movie fatigue. Because Disney bought it and went, we're going to release one movie a year.
Right.
And I was like...
It's just way too much.
Yeah, and I think they found out when Solo came out, and not that Solo wasn't a big bust, it just wasn't, gangbusters making hundreds of millions upon millions like they would want it to. It made its money back. It was successful, just not as successful as they wanted to. And there was a immediate backtrack where they're like, we're gonna take stock on this. And the interesting thing that happened after that was we got The Mandalorian and this focus now on Disney Plus of these new series. And then, so it's a question of sometimes is that all it takes is just a refresh into a different medium to bring your franchise new life.
The
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, The Mandalorian, I just, like, it was just so different compared to, like, other Star Wars films. Like, I almost like how it's pretty much shot like a Western.
It is a Western. I mean, it really is.
It's very interesting. So, definitely refreshing.
Well, and it's interesting. I say it's interesting way too much. Here's a drinking game, everybody who listens to the podcast. Take a shot every time I say it's interesting, and you'll be drunk in no time. Anyway.
I left all my alcohol downstairs.
That's okay. We'll get drunk in the post show, right?
Yeah.
Darn tootin'.
But
the funny thing about Solo is, in hindsight, it was like my favorite of the Disney films. It wasn't the best of them. It was just the one that was more geared towards me. But it took me months to go out and see it because it was like, what, 3 or 4 months after the previous one was released?
Mm-hmm. I want to say 5 months?
Right, 5.
I think Solo came out in May, and Episode 8 was December. The previous December. So yeah, 5 months. Just
like way too short a time.
Well, and I think that could have been the success of the MCU is probably something that put into a company like Disney thinking we can keep going at this and just keep flooding the market with it. But the thing about the MCU is while it shares a universe, each character's stories are separate and unique and interesting. They all intersect, but each film has its own identity.
Yeah, it's like, you watch a film about like a scientist who builds a magic high-tech suit of armor, and then there's one about a doctor who learns magic, and then a third about a super spy, and they could all have been completely separate movies. It's just that those little winks and nods are there if you want to pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say this: props to to everyone behind the MCU. While I might not love every single MCU film, what they've managed to accomplish over the last 12, 13 years now has been nothing short of amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one for the history books there.
Oh, definitely. It's definitely something. It's definitely taken the superhero film, which, let's face it, it needed some air pumped into it. It needed fresh blood. It needed life, to get it really rolling into something that is, to make it kind of, I guess, and different people argue this, but I feel the MCU has managed to turn what people would consider as not cinema into cinema.
Yeah, they've introduced serialized storytelling to it.
Now, I know one thing I'm still kind of curious about is, like, Deadpool, or the 2 Deadpool movies were such a smash success. Why are they still so hesitant to do more mature comic book movies? Because there's so many good, like, mature ones you can go do.
There are. I've seen plenty of examples of ones that have been mishandled, so to speak.
Oh my gosh.
And again, this is all on opinion and perspective. but I'm thinking Hellboy. Punisher was interesting because Punisher got a good run on Netflix there before Disney Plus came out and they pulled everything off of Netflix.
Well, that boy's kind of interesting because like the first two or the original series, like I actually really loved those, but then it's just that reboot. What did they do?
Well, that's so. Is there a sense? Do you feel that the television format, and when I say television, I'm really meaning more streaming content at this point than your traditional television network? Because let's face it, everything is going to streaming now, especially with Disney, the advent of Disney Plus recently, Netflix series over the years, everything is going that direction. So everything's kind of being made for that. Is that format of streaming service content allow for more interesting products to be created on film than, say, your traditional movie?
Well, all I can think of is like, say, like take Devilman Crybaby from the Netflix series. Like that series would not have flown pretty much on any network, but it kind of found its little niche spot in Netflix where it could actually be what it's supposed to go be. So it's like I can go see them like maybe doing like a Spawn series or something on whatever streaming service.
Spawn would be interesting.
And please redo Venom.
Venom.
Like, I want to see my pile of bodies and pile of heads. I can't just talk about it. I kind of want to see it.
Well, that's an interesting point, is through mediums like streaming services, television, is there more flexibility to make your art more like your art than perhaps used to be with regular film, regular cinema?
Well, you have to go keep in mind how, like, say, like, comic books are very serialized formats, so it seems like it would translate pretty well to continue doing a serialized format.
Mm-hmm.
But, because it gives time to flesh out characters and your world.
Mm-hmm. I know, it's a tough thing because I definitely wanted to talk about Star Trek, and I know one thing that got brought up earlier is, and like I'm not at all a fan of Discovery. I'll put that out there. I tried it, I checked it out. It's not my thing. Now, granted, I won't diss on anybody who does like it. I just can't get into it.
Picard seems neat.
Picard, though, I got to see. I haven't seen most of it, but what I have seen, I was very happy with. So, but it's definitely an evolution, and it's different. And a series like Star Trek gets to an interesting place because of how long it's been since we've lost Gene Roddenberry. And there's been a conversation, and for those who aren't familiar with Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry created the series way back in, I guess it was the 60s, and it was his vision that brought forth that and the Next Generation, and he had this real vision of the future where it was more of while there was conflict, it had a more positive outlook on humanity in the future than what we typically get in science fiction. So there's been this constant debate over time about when you add in some of these other elements to it, is it sacrilegious to detract from Gene Roddenberry's vision, or is it add another layer of complexity to bring it to a new audience? And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to that.
I know I've tried to get into Star Trek, and it's not my thing. But then Picard, it seems like it's presented more in a way that like I personally jive with. So I think it's definitely a good way to get new fans in.
Mm-hmm.
So I read something interesting by like one of the people who worked on Picard about that very question, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says that the reason they went for a darker tone with the show is that it's not realistic to have a society in which everything is perfect and there is no conflict. Utopia can't exist. So they wanted to, you know, to tell a story in which this brighter future is forced to choose between two of its values, between freedom and security,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a very real conflict that happens in real life.
Especially
And
lately.
yes, it's very relevant in that regard. And the optimism, it comes in at the end where they do pick the right choice. Everything does work out for the better. It's keeping with Roddenberry's vision, but things don't just work out. You have to actively make that choice, make things work out, do the right thing, even if it's hard.
There's a reason why some of my favorite episodes of any Star Trek series are ones that they have to deal with the Prime Directive and whether or not to violate it.
Yeah.
And that interesting debate internally. I'm a big fan of The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, which that gets to be an interesting conversation with fellow Star Trek fans a lot of times, because not everybody's a big Deep Space Nine fan. I love it, but
That one's my favorite.
yeah, it's very interesting how it gets into the realities of war, but it's not. I feel like it's very believable in its arcs of telling the stories of war, but it's not your traditional like what I would picture seeing in a war film or a war documentary is not what I saw in Deep Space Nine, but it felt very real and it hit me. It definitely hit me. Like, it affected me emotionally. All the various stories throughout. But one of my favorite episodes, actually my favorite episode of The Next Generation, is one called Who Watches the Watchers, which is all about whether or not to violate the Prime Directive and dealing with that, the consequences and what is right and what isn't, which I think is the great unknown all the time, because let's face it, like, our choices are often not easy and it's very muddied most of the time. So to have that was always prevalent, I think, throughout the series. It's just a matter of how much did that play into the overall tone of the series may have adjusted over time. And it could bring in new people, and that's an interesting thing to kind of debate is the change, is some change good to bring new people in to appreciate what's already there.
The way I see it, all the shows we've been talking about have been science fiction shows.
Mm-hmm.
And science fiction shows aren't really about the future, they're about the present. They're about the problems that people are facing today, but told in a fantastic way so you can see them from a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just natural that these shows are going to change over time because the problems that we face as a society are going to change over time.
That's definitely a good point. I know since we have been talking about a lot of science fiction, we can try to maybe shift a little. And I know one property we talked about earlier that I knew would get brought up is talking about the incredible shift in My Little Pony between the generations and what it is now versus what it was. Because if you want to talk about a series that has gone through some transformation, there you have it. And it's I've gone back and watched some G1, in particular the original G1 movie with the great Smooze, and there's some really dark, interesting stuff from back in the beginning in G1, and I think even like everything leading up to G4, everybody had in their mind, this humdrum world of pastel colored horses that, was going to be just all cutesy. But if you actually dig back, there's instances of it not being that. But definitely, here is an example of something that had a radical shift and now has this. The fandom for My Little Pony is something that the fandom that exists today was not the fandom of Pony / My Little Pony in the 80s and 90s.
Well, Pony is a very interesting case because I'd almost argue that there's two distinct fandoms.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's you and me, who are bronies, who came in with G4, and we primarily like the cartoon. But then there's also the collector, who did grow up with, like, the original show, and they're mostly fans of toys. It's always been interesting to me that you had these two very distinct groups, who both like the same intellectual property, but for the most part didn't interact with one another.
Mm-hmm. And I think we get some overlap in it now, but it's definitely still, I would say, still pretty disparate within that. Because I know that there are shows / conventions that are more geared to the toys and even from a collector historical perspective within that never show up on my radar. But I know they're around. But it's something where I probably personally never would have thought to check out. Do I have plenty of pony toys in my house? Oh, you bet your butt.
Yeah.
But it's but it's different because it's kind of just like anything pony that I have is from, like, it's a representation of the property that I love, and it's not necessarily that I am getting them for any kind of, like, this one is rare, so this is the one I want.
Yeah.
I've had my fair share of that in collections over the years, or getting them to literally get them out and play with them in terms of, like, what I would have done as a kid. So there's different ways to approach the same property, which is something to keep in mind with all of these properties and all of these, the legacy properties of, there's so many different facets within it.
I think half of my pony merchandise isn't even official. It's like band stuff.
Yeah, that's a good chunk of ours.
Like, I really love those Shipfic folder cards.
Oh, yes.
Those are the best.
Just shifting through a pack. Like before we stream.
Those are going in a museum one day.
Oh, yeah. There's something to be said about a fandom where just by the nature of the fandom itself creates new merchandise and new ideas to take some just piece of intellectual property into new fields that it never would have gone in before. And you could argue the positive and negative connotations within that.
There's a lot of artistically inclined people in this fan.
Oh my gosh. I'm so jealous.
Me too.
Yeah, I know. As I look at my fiance artist over here. At least I've got you.
I gotta get off my butt and do things.
It's something we definitely see in Pony. And one thing that I've noticed, I've been doing conventions for like 6 years now or so. And most of the conventions that I attend are either Pony or anime / multi-fandom. But there's a lot of things that I love that don't I don't get to go to specific conventions for, whether it be, like I've never been to a science fiction specific convention or say a Star Trek convention, things like that, both of which have existed in my time that I could have gone to. I've just never been able to get to one. So it's kind of one of those things where I've always been curious about noticing the differences in how various fandoms are when they get together like that.
I expect there's less hugging.
Yeah, less fun.
So I don't remember how many years ago it was. It was a few years back. John Delancey was at BronyCon, and it was his first time there in a few years, and I got to ask him what he felt was one of these big differences, or what he's felt having not been at a convention for years and coming back to pony conventions, and what it was about the fandom that kind of he got as a takeaway. And the thing he said back was that he felt there is a spirit within the pony community and the brony fandom that he is yet to find in any of his other travels. And this man is quite traveled. And, that's one of those things I think that just does make me smile. As much as we get into moments of drama or infighting within the fandom, at its core, there is a sense of community that is still there despite all of that, which is wonderful to see.
Thing of beauty.
Now, that being said, I mean, even within our fandom, though, we've had our fair share of moments. And it's interesting because it's what you were talking about with Doctor Who, like when we get new incarnations of the Doctor and such, is there's that instant, oh my gosh, this is not going to be good, or I don't want this reaction. And I feel we've had that still with Pony too. I know the thing that comes to mind recently is leading up to the finale, when the series finale was getting leaked, and there were people who just were not having it about the finale and were like sending messages to Big Jim Miller and such, which was just
do that.
So sad to see. But it's one of those instances where I kind of went within and went, why are people doing this? And I think that's that great question to ask, because it's so easy to just go, people are jerks. And
yeah, I was gonna say that
everybody can be jerks, but it's kind of like in some ways it can almost be a cop-out too, of is there a sense of, because I know with a property like this and a lot of these legacy properties, when we consume them, I know for me personally, watching Pony, and especially in the finale, was more than just watching a cartoon. Because it has had such an impact in my life. I mean, it's literally changed my life. Without Pony, I wouldn't have found the woman I'm going to marry. So...
Oh, hi. Didn't see you there.
Didn't see me as you sit right next to me. But, so, it's emotional and it means something to me. And I think another point to that is being a brony and having lived through a time, and it's still there, but I think it definitely decreased over time. But especially when the fandom was originally forming, there was a lot of just negative press and negative opinion towards the fandom that existed out there for people who didn't understand it or didn't know and just looked at like, oh my god, this is a bunch of guys who are freaks. And there was a sense that, I know for me, internally, there was always this inner sense that I had to like validate that I like, yeah, I'm a brony and I'm proud to call myself a brony, and here's why. And so when the series would have like a down week and such, it would definitely, I think, disappoint me a little bit more because I did hold it to such a high standard, which again could just be, it's just, that's technically on me, but I feel that's something that is a constant thread, wouldn't you say? That when you get really into a property, it becomes more.
One thing I found kind of interesting in the early days of the fandom was it was like I remember like going to EQD like every day and kind of just like waiting for like a new announcement being like, hey, like another news station or someone mentioned Pony in some vein, and then it's like, okay, is it good or bad? And then it's just like, if it's good, then it's like, it's almost validating. So it's like people that are like, oh, why are you into that? And I'll be like, well, this
Back.
famous person likes it.
Pony, I know for me, is it gave me a community, it gave me friends, it gave me a fiance through this fandom, and it gave me a series that made me smile and made me happy and taught values that I really bought into, and it made me go, oh my god, here's a bunch of people who also buy into it. This is actually possible. So when I would see a down episode, or for me, the big one was the movie. Say what you will about the movie. I know a lot of people do love it. I don't. And I was very much, like, it really hurt, actually, after watching it. And I calmed down. It's been a few years now, and I've calmed way down about it. But when I first saw it, I was just like, I think in my head, I had this build up, like, there's finally going to be a movie, and there's going to be something that I can be like, look, guys, like, this is real. Like, there's a reason that this fandom exists, and here's a great property. Go to the movie theater and go see this thing. And then I just didn't like the movie, and I think that expectation on my part made me like it less, made my just inner just turmoil over it grow, because I wanted it to be more than what it was, which probably was not fair of me to put that expectation on it.
There was a bunch of things not going for the movie for you.
I think like you've made a really good point here. Like all of your experiences with ponies are pretty much my experiences. I won't repeat it, but look at something like Star Wars. Like, it's easy to just dismiss people getting upset that a movie sucked. But for me personally, Star Wars was something that I enjoyed as a child. I saw the first movie with my dad when I was like 5. I played the game as sitting in the basement on my dad's computer. This is something from my childhood that I really like. And I think with a lot of fandoms, you get that personal connection where it's a part of your life. It sort of shapes who you are as a person.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think that's where the great debate comes in now for these properties that have existed for so long. I mean, Star Wars has been around for over 40 years now. Star Trek, over 50. Doctor Who is over 50.
3 years older than Star Trek.
Mm-hmm. And even we go with Pony. Pony's been around for about, like, it's going on 40 years. If you want to get technical about it. So these franchises have touched us when in different ways and at different times. And so there's this constant, I feel, debate or struggle that a lot of us have within ourselves. And I've said this before, that in some ways it feels that life is a constant battle between nostalgia and progress. And not necessarily that you can't have both, but it's tough sometimes to be able to look at change and new iterations of things, because you have what is you've held on to and been so important to you and you don't want that to go away. You don't want to detract from it.
I think an interesting. I mean, I guess not really a franchise, but like it's an anomaly. Let's go with anomaly is anime.
Okay.
Because it's like you think like like you have a pony convention or you have a Star Trek convention, Star Wars convention, whatever. But then anime is just kind of like it doesn't have like a convention to a specific show. It's just the genre itself, which I find interesting. Like I can honestly see that fandom almost growing in a similar way as pony.
What is as and just otaku in general?
Yeah, because it's like I'm starting to notice how like anime is becoming a lot more mainstream. Because like I mean, we had the freaking Ghost in the Shell movie come out recently, good or bad, and like all of these like live action things on Netflix, and it's like I'm finding it kind of interesting how it's sort of like Pony, where it went to this like almost like not necessarily taboo, but like now it's like starting to get more into the mainstream and popularized. Kind of curious where it goes.
It's one conversation that you and I had, Rose, before the podcast was if there were any anime properties we would look at as legacy properties. And there are anime that went on forever.
Well, I mean, you have like basically the big three, which is Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece.
Well, and Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball might be the one that I would point to because there have been several takeoffs on it at this point. Because you had regular Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super, exactly. And we've had movies come out over the years. There was one not that long ago, if I'm not mistaken. So there's some of that to an extent, but I don't think there's that much, and I think that that's definitely an interesting point. That being said, I do notice that depending on what series you're into, might get you like the dirty look from some people.
Then don't even get me started on the waifu wars.
I think you might be looking at it from too much of a Western perspective.
Oh, that's definitely. I mean, it is an interesting point too of like being in the West. It's gonna be my
because for us, anime really only started coming here in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at something like, say, Astro Boy, that's a pretty long-running property. I believe first appeared in the 50s. So, like how many Astro Boy animes have there been?
That's a good point.
You have the original comics. You have the parents who read the original comics, showing them to their kids and to their grandkids, and all this, we didn't really see in the West, but it's from their perspective, it's one of those legacy properties.
Yeah. Oh no, that's a very good point.
Then Devilman.
Devilman's its own can of worms.
Well, I mean, it's
but I think you're definitely hitting on something there because it has influenced many series. It has had different kind of, I don't want to say incarnations, but it's shown up. The concept of Devilman and things from the original property have worked its way into various other works.
I know. I mean, it's one of the first mangas, I believe. Because I mean, it came out in like the 50s or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like that thing's old. I'll have to double check on that though.
I think overall, the one thing that is evident from both Eastern and Western is there are iconic properties that we're still even if we aren't getting that exact property today, we are seeing its influence in a variety of other things.
Well, I mean, look at Astro Boy.
Well, yeah, that's true. Because since you brought up Astro Boy, we just had this fantastic episode of DuckTales. Oh my gosh.
Funny thing about that, the author of the original Astro Boy was pen pals with Carl Banks, the guy who was writing the original Scrooge McDuck comic,
Huh.
and like they drew a lot of artistic inspiration from one another.
I did not know.
Small world.
Yeah.
So, I think a big question that I kind of want to, we're getting a little close to time, but one thing that I really kind of want to touch on is we've brought up this idea of growing up with a series or having a series that touches you, and then you're going to look how you're going to look at it as it grows and changes. What is kind of our responsibility almost, or what is it that we as fans need to do to be able to respect a property while also expecting it to continue to have an impact and be great at, simultaneously? Because we want to see it grow and thrive and be great, but then we've also seen where you'll kind of have new fans coming into a property and the old school fans being like, oh no, and then they have a disconnect. So where is the line? Is there a line?
I think like a very important thing that people keep forgetting is that uh, once a work of art is created, at least in the modern day, it exists forever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with Doctor Who, this entire fandom cycle, it goes a lot faster than normal, so it's a lot easier to pick up on the pattern. And one of the things is the episodes you love, the part of the show that you love, the era of it, it's still there and it's always going to be there. You know, if the Tom Baker era was your favorite, it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he's not the Doctor anymore, but you could still go back and you can watch those episodes,
Exactly.
and no one can take that away from you. And on some level, I understand the desire to have things remain the same because nostalgia, but you can't keep telling the same story over and over and over again. You have to do something new, and maybe it's better and maybe it's worse, but that doesn't take away from the original.
Mm-hmm. I think it's with properties, and Star Wars is really coming to mind with the fact of having the series now on Disney Plus, and there's also, I know, some comic runs that started not that long ago for Star Wars, relatively new ones, that you have these various methods of storytelling in various formats that you can pick up something. You can choose whether or not you want to pick up something. And if you don't want to pick up on it, it doesn't have to be part of your universe. And I think that's where we get into debates about headcanon versus actual canon. And
Timeless Child is not canon, and no one will convince me otherwise.
Well, I don't. There is a sense that people have, and I've seen this a lot, especially the more that I've gotten to interact with people who work on these series, and in particular Pony, where the feedback that I've gotten from show staff is that fans really want to know definitively what is canon. And that's that is a blanket statement. It obviously doesn't apply to everybody, but they get that. That's the feeling they get because that's what people approach them. They want to know, is this how it is? And in some regards, some things are intentionally made open-ended. And I think that that's a great thing, and that's while we want to appreciate canon, continuity, all of these things, the danger sometimes we run into is detracting from somebody else's enjoyment within it.
And
People can take away different things from the same property, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
and what is canon anyway? I mean, it's all fiction.
It's true.
One thing I've seen is like people that are like, oh yeah, like everything up to like season 3 is canon or something like that, where it's like completely going to ignore the rest. It's just this is the series.
It stopped being canon when Lauren Faust left.
Oh, I've seen that where it's the pre-Faust and post-Faust, and that's a thing. One thing I will give My Little Pony props for is having an episode where they tackled this issue head on. In the Stranger Than Fanfiction episode with Quibble Pants and Rainbow Dash.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite episodes. We have a literal scene with Quibble Pants' character going, "Oh no, the rest of the books don't exist to me." And Rainbow Dash freaks out about it. And the lesson they both have to learn at the end is we don't always have to agree about this to get along and still appreciate this property. And in this instance, Daring Do. But there are Whovians who are going to have a preference as to what doctor they like. I mean, honestly, that's a pretty common conversation I hear people have is like, are you a 10th Doctor? Or are you a 9th Doctor person? You know?
I really like the 10th Doctor.
I don't know which one's which by number, honey.
Isn't it? I'm pretty sure it was the one before Tenet.
Matt Smith?
Matt Smith. Okay.
I thought he was like...
Wait, no.
11th.
Matt Smith was after Tenet.
I don't know.
Smith was the 11th.
The 11th, okay.
So the 9th. I'm thinking the 9th Doctor.
9th was Eccleston.
There, see? This is why I made sure to get somebody who knew it.
I haven't seen Doctor Who in like 6 years.
Yeah.
But there can be people who can appreciate bits of something. There's going to be, in Star Wars, you're going to have people who are going to always love the original trilogy and just hold to that. And, you know, we had the expanded universe that was around for so long. And one thing that there was a big outcry from a lot of people when Disney came and took over and basically were like, we're gonna write our own stories now. And a lot of fans were like, oh my god, you killed our universe. And it's like, that stuff still exists. Those books still exist. Those comics still exist. You can still go with that.
Grant, I think George Lucas killed that franchise.
We're not going to debate that.
Yeah, like I can boot up X-Wing right now and play X.
I have fond memories of playing Rebel Assault 2 on the PlayStation 1 back in the day.
Star Wars Battlefront 2 is pretty
fun. I also enjoyed the Bounty Hunter game when we got Jango, even though I never really cared for Jango Fett as a character. God, did I love the game.
I really enjoyed the Phantom Menace game for some reason.
Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. The arcade
Yes.
cabinet of that where you actually got to control it like a pod racer. If I could ever own an arcade cabinet, I want it to be that.
That was a good.
Yes, honey, build my arcade for me. But suffice to say, there are great properties that are still around to this day for a reason. And they're still successful for a reason. And different elements of it might touch different people in different ways. And I think that's okay. And I think the big challenge for all of us is to be able to accept that. And it's not always easy, because again, change is scary. Nobody likes change. That is human just behavior 101, is your mind doesn't like it when things change. but we have the ability to grow and adapt within it. And you don't have to like something. I don't like the Star Trek Discovery, for example. I just didn't care for it. But I know there are people who really are enjoying it. And I'm not going to take that away from them. It's there. It's there. It's a part of Star Trek that they enjoy. It's just not one that I enjoy, but that's okay. I'm still a Star Trek fan. They're still a Star Trek fan. We're just into different bits of it. And what we do like, we're each getting something out of, which I think at the end of the day is the most important thing behind all of these properties, is that it's not just that you are consuming the media and just watching it, that you're getting something more out of it than just sitting down for 25 to 55 minutes at a shot just watching something. That we're taking home lessons, we're taking home information that is going to make us feel better and grow as a person. I don't think we can ask for much more.
Nope.
All right, well, that about does it for time for us. I, of course, want to thank everybody for joining, listening in on this episode. I want to thank our wonderful guests. Thank you to our special guest, Brass Robo, for this episode. If you want to tell people how they can find you.
Thanks for having me. So I have an Instagram, Brass Robo, where I do various miniatures, mostly Warhammer and Dungeons and Dragons. So if anyone wants to check out my art, that's where you'd find me.
I've seen them and they are really cool. So definitely check it out, everybody. And
Thank
then,
you.
of course, as always, the lovely and talented Miss Nova Rose.
Which you can find me on Twitter, Nova Roselia. I mostly just post and repost lots of memes. That's kind of what I do.
My fiance, the meme lord, ladies and gentlemen.
Eventually, I'll start doing commissions, but
one thing at a time.
Gotta get the energy.
COVID is draining, y'all. And of course, as always, I'm Forward Progress. You can find me on Twitter at KeepFriendMagic. Visit us on Patreon, patreon.com/KFM. And we'll be hopefully having some updates about potentially more online conventions in the near future. Maybe some more smooth streams if we get that out. But otherwise, we're definitely going to have the podcast keep going. And again, thank you all for listening. And remember to always keep friendship magic out there. Thank you.